Last lesson, we set up our project architecture. So today is all about the foundational models of ARKit, anchors and entities. Hey code crew, this is Flo. With our project architecture ready from the first lesson, today will be all about how you can place content in the scene. We will start with the theoretical foundations and dive into an example in the end. So first of all, before you can place any content in your scene, you need to run a AR configuration. There are a bunch of different ones, and I've already prepared some example code here. You will want to create this configuration, for example, in your initializer of your AR view. Now with our architecture, we're not using the AR view directly because we have created a custom AR view which inherits from AR view. So in its initializer, you would create a configuration and then always call AR session or session.run with set configuration. Now, which configuration you need depends on what you want to do in your AR view. If you only want to place content at coordinates relative to your iPhone, then all you need is the basic AR world tracking configuration. In iOS 15, and as far as I know also in iOS 16, this is the default. So if you only want to place objects relative to the iPhone, you don't actually need to create a configuration. But you, of course, can, and it will not be hurting you, and it will just be more explicit. So I encourage you to always create a configuration, even if you're just placing objects relative to your iPhone's coordinates. Now, there's a very cool configuration which is called geo-tracking. This one allows you to place object with respect to real-life coordinates, so latitude and longitude coordinates. The only downside is that this configuration is only supported in certain regions. As of the date of this recording, it's only supported in some major cities in the US. This can of course change with time, and the reason why this is not supported is because it needs the street view in Apple Maps. This basically does sensor fusion, if you want to hear the fancy name. So it looks at your GPS coordinates and at your camera stream and then matches that camera with what it knows from street view. And that way it can very precisely position you in on the globe, basically. That's why this is not available everywhere. So I would personally hold back with the geo-tracking configuration until more cities worldwide are also supported. Otherwise, users from abroad will not be able to use this. The next configuration is needed if you want to track faces. So for example, if you want to place a virtual mask on a user's face, then you will need a face tracking configuration. And very similarly, if you want to track the user's body, you will need a AR body tracking configuration. Just one more time to repeat, when you want to use one of these configurations, that will tell ARKit what you're going to do, what it has to track, and you will have to create this configuration just a single time and run it on your current AR session, which is just the session property of an AR view. So very simple. Now that you've probably created a configuration, it's time to dive into anchors. Let me first explain to you how ARKit works under the hood. So there are entities, which are basically your 3D objects that you want to place in the scene, and then there are anchors. Anchors tie your objects to a certain place in the scene. So for example, an anchor could be tied to a coordinate in the scene. The coordinates in ARKit are always relative to your iPhone's initial position when you first opened the app. So for example, you could place an anchor 3 meters in front of the iPhone or a meter above the iPhone even. And then these anchors are sitting there still, even when the user moves around, the anchor is still at the same position, and then you can attach entities to those anchors. Now, which configuration you need highly depends on which type of anchor you want to use. So there are a bunch of very simple anchors and also some more advanced ones. I've prepared a few here, so let's dive into them. The first one is just the anchor entity with world coordinates. So this gets passed in a matrix with your world coordinates. Let's have a look at the .0 here, what this actually is. So this is a zimmed3, which is ARKit term for a 3x3 matrix of a scalar value. So for example, a double. Now I went the easy route here and used the zero filled matrix .0. So this would just place an entity at 0, 0, 0. So basically exactly where the iPhone was when the session started. Of course, you can pass in any coordinates here, and then your entity or your anchor will be placed at that specific coordinate. This is the easiest way to use ARKit in my opinion. Next up, you can do plane tracking. This is a bit more fancy. So for example, imagine you want to place a figurine on the floor. Now what you want to do is create an anchor entity on a horizontal plane. This tells ARKit to track surfaces, in this case horizontal surfaces, and place an entity there once it found one. Of course, the same works for vertical surfaces, so just create an anchor entity with a plane of .vertical. You can also allow to track any kind of surface. Next, and this will need one of the configurations from before, in specific the AR face tracking configuration, you can of course also place anchors on a user's face. And the same thing for the user's body, for example. Another very fancy anchor is for images. So for example, if you want to track some markers like a visual code or a printed image or an iPhone or whatever it may be, you can track images in the AR scene using the .image syntax here for your anchor entity. I have never used this myself, so I can't give you much insight on how it actually works under the hood. But this is one of the more fancy ways to create an anchor. And then lastly, whichever kind of anchor you created doesn't really matter, but you will have to add it to the AR scene. Our AR view has a property called scene, which is an AR scene, I believe. Or it's just a scene actually, not from ARKit. And this one has a function called addAnchor, and then you just pass in your anchor. So for example, you would create an anchor at 000 using this syntax up here, and then you can add it to the current scene. So you can later on add entities to that anchor. Okay, so now that you have created your configuration and your anchor, it's time to place some 3D objects there. Of course, there are a bunch of different ways to load assets into your app. I will just go over a few of them. The most basic example is to load an entity from a USDZ file that's included in your project. A USDZ file is just a file type that is created by Apple actually, and that's used for 3D models with textures, so very basic. There's a library of USDZ files online on the Apple developer website where you can just grab a few. Of course, that's very limited, so you would probably want to create your own USDZ files. But loading them is super simple. Just say entity.load and pass in the name of your USDZ file. The same syntax can also be used to load a reality file, for example, from Reality Creator or Reality Converter. I'm not exactly sure which of the two is the iPad app, but you can use that to create reality files, which are actually interactive. So you could also make them do some animations, for example, which is very fancy. Not covered in this lesson though. But loading entities that you already have an asset of in your project, super easy. Just call entity.load named and pass in a string of your file name. Now there's one thing to note, and that's that the load function is failable, so you need to try to do it. So you either have to put it inside of a do catch block or just use the try optional operator here. And then another very cool method to create entities is to do it by code. So you just use the mesh resource.generateBox function, and you can pass in a size here. As I said, it's a cube, so this is the size of the edges, in this case 1 meter. Then you create an entity from your mesh resource. So just a model entity from our box. And then you're already done basically. Of course, now you could add colors or textures to this entity. This is the way that you can generate entities by code if you only need something very simple. Lastly, as always, you need to add it to the scene somehow. So you will have to have an anchor of some sorts. Now I just have a dummy anchor here. Obviously in reality, you will have one of the anchors that I showed you in the previous examples. And then you just call anchor.addChild of your new entity. Okay, lastly, let's have a look at all of this in action. So as I've told you about, the AR world tracking configuration is free basically. It just runs by default. So I have not created a specific configuration here. What I have done is created a function called placeBlueBlock, and I've called that function in our initializer, which we are actually using. So if you remember from the last lesson, we have two required initializers, but we're not actually using them. We're just using this convenience initializer here. And in there, I'm calling the placeBlueBlock function. Now in this function, I'm using code to generate an entity. Let's have a look at it. So I'm creating a mesh resource.generateBox with a edge size of 1 meter. Basically exactly the same as in the entity example beforehand. Then I create a simple material, which is a way to color that box. So I chose the color blue and I've set isMetallic to false. If you set this to true, it will of course be metallic as the name suggests, so it will reflect light from the actual environment, which looks really cool. Then I will create an entity, same as before. So a model entity passing in our block mesh, but also passing in a list of materials. In this case, we just have our simple material, which is a blue color that's not metallic. Then I create an anchor entity that's anchored at the horizontal plane. So when you open the app, ARKit will look for any horizontal plane that it can detect, for example, your desk or your floor. And then I will add our entities or blue block to that anchor. So now it's attached to that anchor and will always stay at this exact position that we've specified with the anchor. And lastly, I've added the anchor to our scene in the AR view. Since I've called this method in the initializer, it will run once the app opens. So let's have a look at that right now. Okay, so in this lesson, you learned how objects can be placed in the AR scene, which kinds of anchors and configurations are available, and how you can load your different assets.